So I want to welcome everybody here. My name is Lisa Lacona. I am a assistant professor of systematic theology at St. Bernard's School of Theology in Rochester, New York, which is quite a ways away from New York City. And I am delighted to be here. I listened to the keynote this morning. I was really impressed, and I think there's going to be some really interesting discussions that arise from this conference. I'm going to begin by just pulling up my introductions here on this computer that I finally figured out how to mute. And read you the introductions of our three speakers today. So I'm just getting that up here. Now this stream is called Catholic Women, Prophetic in the Ordinary. And our first paper is from Dr. Pat Jones. Dr. Jones is at Durham University. And the title of this paper is Be Proud to be a Worker Girl, the Impact of YCW on Working Class Catholic Girls in the Post-War Era. Dr. Jones.
Thank you. I'm going to share screen, so hope that will work. Can you see it? Okay, great. So Be Proud to be a Worker Girl is taken from a chorus in the songbook of the Girls YCW in England in 1951. YCW, Young Christian Workers, was an international movement of young working class Catholic girls and lads. Founded in Belgium in the 1920s, it took root in England just before the Second World War, then expanded rapidly afterwards. In 1949, there were 164 sections, each with teams of girls from 15 upwards. During the 1950s and into the 60s, it expanded further with about 18,000 members in both lads and girls groups by the mid-60s, before a gradual decline from the 70s onwards. It still exists, however, and its spirit is still fresh. The movement, as it was known, had a transformative and lifelong impact on the lives of those who joined. In Gerd Rayner Horn's words, it enabled, quote, autonomous radicalization. It changed the way that young working class Catholic girls saw themselves and gave them a sense of what was then known as their apostolic calling. In this paper, I draw on research in the English YCW archives to describe its significance for young working class Catholic women and to explain why it matters as a study of lived Catholicism. The song is worth a further look. The final verse reads, let me just change my screen. We're heirs of Christ, God's daughters dear, no slaves or beasts are we. We wish to earn our daily bread in Christian dignity. So banish hate from out your heart and face life fearlessly. Your fellow worker, Christ your King, to work gave dignity. And then follows the chorus, be proud to be a worker girl like Christ your worker King. For carry on the world would not, save you your labor bring. In these few lines, the themes of YCW's impact are visible. It enabled a particular social class-based group to understand and feel their own value and their dignity. It located that dignity in significant degree in what they did in their workplaces, the factory bench, the cotton mill, the shop counter, the laundry, and other places that they found employment. Their mundane, ordinary tasks mattered. And it was in and through the details of their working life that they would Christianize the world. YCW was about working class occupations. They debated even whether teachers were allowed to join, as they were not seen as working class at that time, but rather a level up in the social hierarchy. A third key element is added by a few lines which conclude another song. So march on, march along, sing our conquering song. With shoulder to shoulder, girls advance, till the whole of our land is more Christian, more grand. The future is ours, girls advance. YCW was above all activist. It was designed to make girls into leaders who were consumed by the need to act, to change the conditions of working life for young workers. Crucially, it was equipped with a pedagogy which was both revolutionary and utterly suited to its demographics and tasks. The triadic structure of See, Judge, Act is now well known. having featured in papal social teaching encyclicals and in the thought underpinning liberation theology, but its origins in the YCW or Josiste movements is rarely recognized. Joseph Cardine, the Belgian priest who founded YCW, later made a cardinal at Vatican II, founded it as a specific response to the impact of 19th century European industrialization on the Catholic working classes. Cardine, Paul Misner says, emphasized and practiced the principle of worker autonomy and self-governance more consistently and methodically than any other socially progressive priest. YCW spread from Belgium across Europe and globally. Misner details how the post-war decades were the era of the Christian labor movement's greatest mobilization. YCW, he says, made a contribution to enabling, quote, the social partnership model of post-World War II Western Europe. Horn adds that Vatican II cannot be understood without seeing the continuity with thinkers such as Cardine and social movements such as YCW. But back to the working class girls in the 1950s. In England at that time, the school leaving age was 14 until 1947, and then 15 until 1972. Working class girls, the majority at that point, went into domestic service or into factories and shops. They had little voice, poor protection, and frequently inadequate conditions. Many ended up in sanatoria suffering from TB. They had almost no power over their own lives. For young Catholic girls, a narrow moral narrative was dominant. They were to keep themselves pure, then marry and have children, and in the words of Pius XI in Casti Connubii in 1930, occupy, quote, a truly regal throne within the walls of their homes. They were not to regard themselves as having equal rights to their husbands. That was, Pius said, quote, debasing of the womanly character and the dignity of motherhood. YCW proposed a different narrative, and its significance for girls especially has been little recognized. Girls were recruited one-to-one, often invited first to a social event, a beetle drive, whatever that is, or a dance, and then drawn into a cycle of meetings. The concept of sphere of influence was woven into how the movement expanded. Each girl was expected to recruit others. The phrase like to like summed up their theology and their strategy. Misner describes it as the pivot on which the whole JOC movement turned. They had a strong sense of the worker milieu and a belief that only young workers could reach and engage other young workers. Once gathered into teams, they received training or formation, as it was called. They met each week to talk about their working life. They were charged to bring a fact of the week to each meeting, and they left each time with an action to do and then reported back the following week. The matters they discussed seemed mundane: the need for washrooms or for ventilation, the lack of training, and the plight of girls who were sick and unable to work. But it was precisely in the ordinary that what they sought and found meaning. One of the messages YCW held dear was the idea that your workbench is your altar. Your task was to make your workplace into a cathedral. A campaign report from July 1950 describes how YCW worked. In a machine shed where 100 girls worked, there is no window open, no access to boiling water for a brew, one nurse for 500 girls. And the girls have to clean the machines while they're in motion because they're on piecework. The YCW leader writes, quote, it has taken me many weeks of slow influence on the 6 girls who are in my own room, representatives of the various jobs we do, to take action on these problems. As a group, we approached the welfare officer, the manager, and the trade union official. The girls spoke up very well, giving facts on all the problems mentioned and the effects of these problems on the girls' health. This interview with the manager was very enlightening as he told us of new plans to provide facilities. She goes on, but I'll stop there because it gives the picture. YCW aimed to make the girls into leaders, to shape them as they grew into young adulthood, intending that this would last their lifetimes. My research also involved interviews with 6 women aged from 50 to 90 who were YCW leaders in their youth. All described the lifelong impact of the movement. Even in their 90s and their 80s, they remembered the message Cardine preached that, quote, every young worker is more precious than all the gold in the world. YCW girls became activists first in their own workplaces. Then some became regional leaders or national organizers. This picture shows the national team, the young women who became national organisers in the early 1950s. I have it because my mother is the middle figure. Crucially, until 1967, YCW was organised along gendered lines with substantially separate boys and girls movements. Although they collaborated, they also had separate campaigns, study days and retreats. This was profoundly important. It meant that all the leadership in the girls' movement was by girls themselves. They were not dominated by the men, but equal partners and sometimes more successful. In an era when Catholic women held almost no leadership roles in the church and few in society, this was radical, even more so because these young women were not educated or middle class. YCW taught them to speak in public, to chair meetings, to write reports, to strategize, and they did so very successfully. Finally, why this illustrates paradox and prophecy in lived Catholicism. First, it gave young Catholic girls an alternative narrative to the restrictive Catholic teaching of the time, which viewed them as wives, mothers, and homemakers only. YCW occupied a delicate position at times, determined to be recognized and affirmed by popes and bishops, but also claiming its own radicalizing vision and specialized nature. The paradox of YCW for girls in these decades was that it liberated and empowered them, promoting gender equality and public activism, whilst holding to a traditional Catholic spirituality, as the songbook shows. But it also then tipped them into marriage and conformity with traditional gendered, social and Catholic expectations. But perhaps not entirely. James Chappell argues in his study of what he terms paternal and fraternal Catholic modernism, that the Cardine movements were one of the vectors through which modern ideas about marriage as a partnership of equals spread to popular levels. And second, the focus on the workplace as a primary place of social mission matters still, because it is now largely lost. The narrative of where the mission of the baptized actually takes place has retreated to the ad intra life of the church, the domestic family, and the works of charity, with social and environmental justice scrabbling for space and inclusion. The hard work of changing the social and economic conditions of employment, or even just living your faith in your working life, is barely mentioned in the pastoral life of the church. This matters because after family, work is the dominant aspect of most of our lives. It is where Catholicism is lived, although we no longer have much sense of what this means. And finally, because the voices of young Catholic girls, particularly those who come from disadvantage or poverty, are still almost never heard, and they have a freshness and prophetic call which still resounds. One final example in an article in the Young Worker newspaper by Renée Tomlin, speaking around 1950. She describes going to a trade union meeting at which middle-aged men ramble on, speaking in what she describes as double Dutch, unintelligible jargon. She continues, "It's understandable if you vow never to go again, but this won't do. Don't wait for something important to turn up. Go to your next union meeting, get to grips with the standing orders, ask for fatherly advice, get yourself elected. Once you've got onto the committee, there is no knowing where you will stop." One of the women I interviewed said, quote, "I can remember thinking and feeling that we could do anything we wanted and we could change the world."
Thank you. That was a wonderful paper. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Moving on, we're going to go to Ms. Evan Mcgraw. Evan is at the University of St. Andrews, and she's going to be presenting a paper on how the stories of Flannery O'Connor can heal a divided church.
All right, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, I agree. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for the paper. I look forward to talking about it afterwards. I'll just jump right into mine, I suppose. So soon after I became Catholic, a woman in my parish asked me whether I considered myself a traditionalist or a modernist. Another Catholic friend recently told me that he'd pick traditionalism over modernism because it was supposedly the lesser of two evils. Until I started encountering this sort of language, it hadn't occurred to me just how divided the church is, especially in North America. Much of this division seems to be over arguments about ecclesiology, what role the sacraments play in salvation, whether those outside the church can be saved, where grace is and isn't. The supposed traditionalists fear a modernist attempt to so thoroughly water down Christianity that it loses its particularity, while the modernists fear the traditionalist radical Pharisaical rigorism. Now, I'm a fairly young Catholic and certainly don't have the theological clout to critique the entire church, but it does seem to me that amid all this ecclesial conflict, there's a more fundamental issue going on, namely that the people most embroiled in this debate tend to lose sight of what grace actually is. I once heard a Dominican describe grace as something like a power-up in a video game. And I've heard Catholics talk about grace like a sort of object you rack up to get to heaven. This seems misguided to me because it turns salvation into something mechanical and transactional and treats the church like a monstrous vending machine for grace. With such skewed views of grace, often obscured by theological abstractions, it's no wonder the church is in conflict. You can't argue about where grace is and isn't if you're unable to recognize the presence of grace in lived experience. This is where Flannery O'Connor, the 20th century Southern Gothic American writer, offers a valuable and pertinent critique to the contemporary church. Her stories recall us to what grace actually is as a lived experience, that it is a personal encounter with Christ, that it is shocking and disarming, and that it cannot be reduced to a theological abstraction. Her short story, The Temple of the Holy Ghost, offers such a recollection and thereby critiques both the sacramental rigidity of traditionalists and the supposed universalism of modernists. The protagonist is a scathingly intelligent 12-year-old child who is disdainful of everyone around her. When her cousins visit, she decides, quote, that they were practically morons, and she was glad to think that they were only second cousins and she couldn't have inherited any of their stupidity. Now, what's so interesting about her character is how her specifically Catholic identity increases her sense of pride. At one point in the story, some Protestant boys come visit and they sing some flaccid, sentimental hymns. In response, the girl's cousins confound the boys by singing the Tantum Ergo in Latin, to which one of the boys responds, "That must be Jew singing," and he began to tune his guitar. The girls giggled idiotically, but the child stamped her foot, says, "You big dumb ox," she shouted. "You big dumb Church of God ox." She roared and fell off the barrel and scrambled up and ran around the corner of the house. And of course, this is most likely a reference to Aquinas, who was also called the big dumb ox. But the point is that here the Tantum Ergo, and by extension the Eucharist, is a source of division and disdain on the child's part. At another point, she fantasizes about her own martyrdom. She thinks she would have to be a saint because that was the occupation that included everything you could know. And yet she knew she would never be a saint. She did not steal or murder, but she was a born liar and slothful, and she sassed her mother and was deliberately ugly to almost everybody. She was eaten up also with the sin of pride, the worst one. She made fun of the Baptist preacher who came to school at commencement to give the devotional. She would pull down her mouth and hold her forehead as if she was in agony and groan, "Father, we thank thee," exactly the way he did, and she had been told many times not to do it. She could never be a saint, but she thought she could be a martyr if they killed her quick. And so she imagines herself in the Colosseum. The Roman soldiers send lions after her, but one by one they fall at her feet, converted. So they burn her, but of course she doesn't burn until finally, quote, finding that she was so hard to kill, they cut off her head very quickly and she went immediately to heaven. Now, O'Connor is definitely being playful here, but it's still true that even as the girl fantasizes about her own martyrdom, she's disdaining the image of Christ in everyone around her. Her Catholic intellectual pride renders her myopically incapable of seeing the dignity of others. But then grace shows up in a strange and shocking way, reminding readers of who Christ is, illustrating the expansive nature of his operations in the world. Her cousins visit a freak show at a carnival one evening. As she stays behind and imagines the show, she finds herself comparing it to her earlier fantasy of martyrdom. The carnival is bathed in an iconographic gold sawdust light. The tents advertised with faded-looking pictures of people in tights with stiff, stretched, composed faces, like the faces of the martyrs waiting to have their tongues cut out by the Roman soldiers. So here she is already primed for a revelation of the relationship between freakishness and martyrdom, between suffering and grace. Then her cousins return and describe the freak show itself. They tell her about a person they saw who, as one of the girls says, was a man and woman both. This presumably intersex person presents themselves to the gawking onlookers in an almost cultic exhibition on a dark curtained stage. At the same time unsettling and pagan, this presentation also contains definite Eucharistic analogies, suggesting that this apparently perverse freak, by their very strangeness, somehow reflects the image of Christ. The cousins recall the intersex person's blue dress, the color O'Connor often uses to suggest holiness. And the person says to the onlookers, "God made me this way, and if you laugh, he may strike you the same way. This is the way he wanted me to be, and I ain't disputing his way." So O'Connor draws a clear connection between the intersex person, martyrdom, and the imitation of Christ. In accepting their state and the suffering it entails, this person accepts God's will for their life, and in so doing points toward that mysterious lived reality of all the saints and martyrs, the paradoxical unity of love and suffering. As Christ suffered for humanity out of love for us, so too do the martyrs suffer out of love for God. Here O'Connor makes the startling assertion that to a greater or lesser extent, we are also invited to participate in that reality. When we bear our sufferings in love, we are further united with Christ and drawn into his mystery. But what's crucial here is that the grace of suffering doesn't stop with the sufferer. It extends to others as the sufferer reflects the image of Christ. This intersex person, in a larger than life performative manner, presents the mystery of Christ to the child and is therefore a means of grace for her. Near the end of the story, when the child goes to mass with her cousins, the person's words are echoing in her mind. Quote, "When the priest raised the monstrance with the host shining ivory colored in the center of it, she was thinking of the tent at the fair that had the freak in it. The freak was saying, 'I don't dispute it. This is the way he wanted me to be.'" She is now able to see that these words apply to all people, including herself and those she continually disdains. The people she sees as ignorant are made in the image of God and ought to be loved as Christ loved, even in their imperfections. Here the choir sings the Tantum Ergo, but rather than inciting division as it did earlier in the story, it now gives the child an almost mystical sense of unity, spiritually and interpersonally. Christ's incarnation reflects the love that draws people into solidarity with one another. The nearer we draw to Christ, the less we are able to treat fellow sinners and sufferers as other or lesser. So as the story illustrates, the authentic operation of grace profoundly supersedes a mechanistic understanding of the sacraments. In the case of the intersex person, grace comes not only from outside the visible church, but even from outside the bounds of polite society. Grace upsets the normal operations and hierarchies of the world and even of the church, especially when such normal operations and hierarchies lull individuals into prideful complacency. So against the traditionalists, of course there's grace outside the church. Grace can't be tamed. It can't be boxed into a system, even a sacramental or theological one. But now, against the modernists, this vision of grace doesn't mitigate Christian particularity. O'Connor is not advocating a complete universalism in which everything is equally a means of grace. Christ remains the central source of grace, but whenever something or someone conforms to the image of Christ, that thing too becomes a means of grace. About this entire story, O'Connor said to someone in a letter once that if this story sticks with you, it's because of the Eucharist in it. Thus, the intersex person and the story itself both mysteriously participate in that greater reality of the Eucharist. And it's a reality we're all called to participate in. As the child leaves the convent, a stern nun gives her a hug and inadvertently smashes a crucifix against the child's cheek. So the child is literally imprinted with the cross, cementing the necessity to imitate Christ by suffering in solidarity with humanity. Grace is meant to be spread beyond the walls of the church, shared through lives filled with the love of God. In other words, if grace somehow remains in the sacraments, then we are failing to be Christian, failing to be embodied images of God's love. So against a liberal modernist universalism, O'Connor affirms that grace is concrete, cruciform, particular, and ultimately rooted in the sacraments. But against a rigid Thomistic traditionalism, she shows how grace cannot and should not be limited even by ecclesiastical and sacramental hierarchies. She manages to avoid these two extremes by recalling us to what grace actually looks like in the world. This experience cuts through the obscurantism of theological and political extremes with a startling clarity, reminding us that Christ is neither a system nor an abstraction. If O'Connor were around today, I suspect she would plead with us not to divorce our theology of grace from our lived experience of it. She once referred to her stories as hymns to the Eucharist. And I think that's really fitting because they reveal the incredible mystery of what it means to physically, personally encounter Christ and to be changed by him. Faced by that mystery, how can any of us be content with any ism that limits and flattens the reality of Christ? How can we console ourselves by picking the lesser of two evils, as my friend purported to do? Both extreme traditionalism and extreme modernism are one-dimensional attempts to tame the gospel. Only when we attend to Christ himself, not primarily to arguments about tradition, modernity, politics, only when we first allow the truth of who he is to seep into our deepest selves, will the divisions in the church begin to heal. Perhaps O'Connor might help us in that process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mcgraw. That was really a fascinating paper and really just kind of unfolds what Dr. Jones was already bringing forward. Let's move on to Dr. Terry Tastard. He's at the Cadbury Center for Public Understanding of Religion at Birmingham University. And I hope I haven't completely slaughtered your name there. His paper is Florence Nightingale's Love-Hate Relationship with the Catholic Church.
It was pre-recorded, so I hope that the video will run now. I'm a bit worried. Could the video run? If not, I have the text available.
Let's see, I'm sure our technical...
I'm afraid I haven't been sent the video.
Oh dear, I guess I better press on.
Sorry.
Florence Nightingale was born in 1820 and died in 1910, and over the course of her long life, she had many contacts with the Catholic Church, and for a time felt a powerful attraction to it. Yet in the second half of her life, this feeling soured, and her interaction with Catholicism became increasingly rare. In her 30s, she had considered the possibility of becoming a Catholic, so that she might also become a religious sister. The nursing undertaken by nuns in Europe attracted her because it offered her a way out of the stultifying control of her parents. In 1852, she consulted Manning, the future cardinal, and seemed to be on the brink of asking to be received into the church. She told him in July of that year that she was, quote, a fervent disciple of the Catholic Church. Compare that with what she wrote in 1896. There is no God and no Christ in the great RCs nowadays. It is all the worldly eminence of the church. So what happened? I want to suggest that we can trace at least two causes of her change of heart. The first is her experience during the Crimean War, when Nightingale repeatedly clashed with a powerful Irish Mother Superior. The second is the influence of Unitarian culture, which created in her a strongly rationalist disposition. Nightingale's religious upbringing was eclectic. With her family, she attended the Church of England and Methodist churches, but 3 of her 4 grandparents were Unitarian. Her struggles with her family were because she felt strongly called to make nursing her profession. Her parents considered this utterly inappropriate for a woman of her class. And with difficulty, she persuaded them to allow her to study nursing with the German Deaconess Institution and with the Sisters of Charity at the Maison de la Providence in Paris. In June 1852, she wrote to Manning, "If you knew what a home the Catholic Church would be to me, all that I want I would find in her. All my difficulties would be removed. The daughters of St. Vincent would open their arms to me. They have already done so. And what should I find there? My work already laid out for me, my home, my sympathy, human and divine. There's an air of urgency in her letters at this time. Quote, I have a precipice behind me. If I do not reach the Church of the Catholics, I have no church. So there she was on the brink of conversion, maybe even becoming a religious sister, yet Manning did not pluck this ripe fruit. It seems that he discerned that she wanted the active apostolate of the church, but not its doctrinal foundation. You suspect me of eclecticism, she wrote to him. And then later on, she says that he accuses her of intellectual dishonesty. And then 2 years later, when she left for the Catholic Church, when she left for the Crimean War, she was still in touch with Manning, but her fervor to convert had cooled. Nightingale's time in Crimea was closely associated with two groups of Sisters of Mercy. The first, mostly English sisters, led by Mother Mary Clare Moore of the convent in Bermondsey, South London. I'm sorry, I'm coming back to you now. I was slightly thrown by something off to my left. The second group consisted of Irish sisters and was led by Mother Mary Frances Bridgman of the convent at Kinsale in County Cork. Clare Moore became Nightingale's lifelong friend, but Nightingale was soon locked in a relationship of mutual hostility with Frances Bridgman. Clare Moore and her sisters had arrived with Nightingale at Scutari in October 1854, and they'd worked with her right from the start in the attempts to cope with the inflood of people severely wounded at the Battle of Inkerman. But these were all the Catholic nursing sisters that Nightingale wanted or expected. It was therefore a surprise for her when Mother Frances Bridgman and her party of 15 Sisters of Mercy arrived from Ireland in mid-December. She had not asked for them, and she reacted badly to their arrival. She was afraid that the extra number of nuns would arouse fears that they were there with other Catholics to pray, as it were, P-R-E-Y, among the sick soldiers and convert them to Catholicism. Nightingale refused even to meet the new arrivals and sent a message that there was no place for them. This was an indescribable shock to us all, Bridgman wrote later, and the news angered and bewildered her. They'd answered an urgent call to help sick and wounded soldiers. The British government had encouraged them and authorized their going out, and now they were being told there was no place for them in the hospitals under Florence Nightingale. A compromise was worked out. Irish sisters joined with others to open a hospital a few miles away at Coolally. Nightingale refused to have anything to do with it, but Bridgman and her sisters acquitted themselves well there. And in October 1855, when Coolally was about to close, Nightingale was astounded and angered when she heard that Bridgman had negotiated a new deal directly with the Army Medical Director in Crimea. The Irish nuns would take over another hospital at Balaclava. Nightingale was furious because she regarded herself as being in charge of all nursing, and this independent action as undermining her authority. She now paired Irish and Catholic. She resorted in private correspondence to accusations about the Irish nuns that included wasteful expenditure, lying, and even alcohol abuse. By strengthening, I quote, by strengthening the Irish RCs here, she wrote, the government raise up enemies to themselves. And she wrote also, there's none so coarse as an Irish RC priest. And later, 2 years after their return, so she'd been nursing this, later, in evidence to a royal commission, she would imply that the Irish in general were careless about personal cleanliness. These ethnic slurs indicate that she never overcame her resentment at being outwitted by Irish Catholic nuns. Despite her growing dislike of all things Irish and Catholic, Nightingale retained a profound respect for Mother Mary Clare Moore and the Bermondsey community of Sisters of Mercy. In subsequent years, she corresponded frequently with Clare Moore and asked for advice on spiritual reading. Nightingale read avidly the authors recommended by Moore. She was especially drawn to mystics who had faced misunderstanding, resistance, and ridicule. She identified with them in her own experience of struggling for healthcare reform, and among her favorites were Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross. One of the surprises when we look at what she wrote about her spiritual being is how little it influenced what she already believed. She read to be strengthened, encouraged, edified, but all within the confines of what she already thought. By 1870, Nightingale was planning an anthology of extracts about spirituality, accompanied by her own commentary on the texts. This book did not appear, but if it had, Nightingale's idiosyncratic commentary would probably have surprised Clare more. Take the example of one example I would give, Teresa of Avila's fourth soliloquy, where Teresa asked God to redeem lost time. Quote, "The more I hear of your greater marvels and consider that you can add to them, the more my faith is strengthened. Recover, my God, the lost time by giving me grace in the present and future." So it's a prayer of humility, asking God to redeem personal failure by making a different outcome possible. But Nightingale turns the prayer around to focus on what can be achieved by the petitioner. In the rambling note, she says the prayer is about perfection. I quote, "Realized in life and work, we cannot conceive of perfect wisdom, perfect happiness, except as having been attained through work." So Teresa's soliloquy starts with human frailty and turns to the necessity of divine help, but Nightingale's interpretation instead emphasizes confidence in what humans can achieve. She believed in human perfectibility. Most of the people around Nightingale in her formative years were Unitarian. It is this that seems to influence Florence, especially after the Crimean War, and the inevitable effect was to draw her away from Orthodox Christian doctrine. There was a strong reformist and even radical tradition within Unitarianism, with an emphasis on the progress that could be made by enlightened human beings. Nightingale's aunt, May Smith, was a crucial influence on her. May Smith's Unitarian beliefs held that the universe ran by immutable laws. Human fulfillment lay in learning those laws and how to work with them. Although Nightingale moved away later from strict determinism, she retained a strong belief that there were moral laws that ran alongside the laws of nature. To find these and work with them enabled progress. This was the human challenge. Nightingale's own understanding of Christianity was similar to this aspect of Unitarianism. God created human beings capable of infinite progress. She wrote, "Everything is left to us. It is we who have to do it. God only supplies means and inducements. Each man is to help in the creation, that is, in the perfection of mankind. This is the practical religion of our lives." Unitarianism, by rejecting the divinity of Jesus, also rejected the idea of atonement. However, because she does not believe in atonement, Nightingale doubts the objective reality of sin. Sin becomes a chance for human beings to learn through their mistakes to choose more wisely. Sin is a necessary component of a world moving to perfection. And she says, we cannot explain or conceive of perfection except as having been worked through imperfection or sin. A traditional Christian might object that this seems to smooth away the roughness, the very agony of human existence, by making it all part of a process of evolution. Sin, in fact, hardly exists. It's surprising that Nightingale, who saw close up the waste and destruction of war, did not have a more trenchant view about human weakness. Nightingale's belief in human perfectibility left little room for failure. Freud's understanding of a love-hate relationship tells us that where strong negative feelings exist, there's also an implicit attraction which is simultaneously denied. Nightingale's initial fascination with Catholicism cooled and turned into something very different. Yet her continued reading of the mystics and her wrestling with them suggests that she still felt something there that called out to her. That's the end.
Thank you so much. You did a great job delivering that in the clutch there. This was wonderful. I'm struck by all three of these papers. And I want to invite those of you who are attending to feel free to jump in right now and type questions. There's a Q&A button that you can enter a question in, and I will read it out to our presenters. I just want to say that I'm very struck. I don't know who was involved in arranging these sessions, but I'm very struck at the kind of inner unity of all three of these papers in different ways, highlighting how it seems to me how deeply incarnational Catholicism has to become again and again. The word has to take flesh, and it's only when we attend to that that we really start to see, as you were saying, Ms. Mcgraw, the way that grace is really at work in the world. So I'm going to begin with the first question we have in the Q&A chat box here, which is for our first presenter, Dr. Jones. Two questions. One, how much of the motivation, if a motivation at all, for YCW organization was to ensure Catholic rather than communist influence within the trade union movement at the time? And the second question, why do you think that the workplace is no longer a focus for Catholic activism or a priority for church leaders, even compared with social justice campaigns or social movements?
Thank you for those questions. Yes, can I say that I'm fascinated by how the themes run across the three papers too, and particularly this emphasis on the ordinary as the graced place, and the ways in which women transform the ordinary in the light of their relationship with Christ. But these questions are obviously fascinating to me, these two questions. I think it was different for YCW in England compared to YCW on the continent, where there was a lot of Catholic action and a far more deliberate and organized communist movement. I think in England, from what I can see from the archives, the YCW at that time sometimes got on quite well with the local communist groups. they'd all been to school together and they worked in the same workplaces. So I think it was on the ground, I think it was often a case of joining up rather than being in competition. On a wider scale, of course, the Catholic worker movements in their different forms in Europe and the UK were trying to, in some ways, replicate within the Catholic milieu some of the organizing ability that the communist movements had. And that's why you see this similarity of approach, similarity of organizing tactics. And I'm sure that Cardine, the founder, was very wise to that, because in founding YCW, he was partly concerned to not abandon the working masses to either communism or then to atheism and the other things that were feared at that time. So I think that's why we need to do research into England and Wales, into the UK, because we had a different positioning of the Catholic community here. We had a different status within the social and democratic systems and the society of the time, and we need to understand that better through some historical study. A really relevant question for the whole Live Catholicism approach about why the workplace is no longer a focus for Catholic activism. I just think this is so important, that this sphere of our lives, which takes up so much of our time and attention, is just rarely discussed. I think it's partly because it's become so much more complicated and systemic and structural, and a sense that to do the small things is perhaps less important. I think it's also because the trade union movement grew, and obviously then in some ways has had to continually renegotiate its place as different governments have come and gone. But a lot of, certainly the theme in Catholic history in England has always been for Catholics to get involved in existing movements for social improvement rather than start their own Catholic version. So I suspect, indeed I know, that there are a whole lot of Catholics involved in trade unions. But sadly, there are few priests or bishops who concern themselves with it. The photograph I showed you earlier had two priests at either end of this group of young women leading. And for the YCW girls of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, their relationship with the chaplains was hugely important. They called them by their names. They didn't have a hierarchical relationship. They had worked together on equal terms, and the priests were subsidiary in their mission, not in charge of it. And I think we have lost that tradition of priests and bishops who realize that their task is to be behind those who want to tackle issues like the need to reform conditions of employment, the need to enable young people to discover that social mission happens in their workplace as well as in their voluntary activism.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question here, or I should say another question for you, Dr. Jones. Do you feel that the YCW was part of the stimulus that eventually led to the National Pastoral Congress in Liverpool? And do you trace a thread to the synodal process of today?
Not directly. I think that, I think that the YCW was part of, and the Cardine movements were certainly part of the stimulus that led to the teaching, the document in Vatican II on the laity, Apostolicam Actuositatem, and to Gaudium et Spes, yes. And in the sense that those documents were part of what then led to the process of attempted pastoral renewal in England and Wales, which led to the Pastoral Congress, then yes. And I also note that at the Congress in Liverpool, which was a synodal gathering of 2,100 Catholics in 1980 that set out a vast vision for the church, there was a whole sector, 300 people, talking about the world of work. And yet when I compare it to more recent diocesan assemblies and congresses and attempts at formation and emphasis on things like becoming missionary disciples, the world of work is not mentioned. So I think one of my fears about the synodal process actually is that it will not pay attention to this hugely important sphere of baptismal life and mission of where we live, Catholicism, because we have sort of edited it out. We don't celebrate it in our liturgy. We don't hear preaching about it. We don't have organizations that direct our attention to it. We don't have a leadership vision that compels us to pay attention to it.
Thank you. I would just say from my own perspective that I teach, a lot of my students are studying for the diaconate. They're getting their master's in theology and pastoral studies for the diaconate. And it really, what you're saying about the inability to see work as relevant as the place where you encounter Christ in your lived circumstances is so prominent in them. They're always talking about balance, by which they mean, I've got my spirituality piece over here and my work piece over here, and somehow I have to find a way to balance them. And they don't see that they're actually living Christian mission and vocation in their work and actually through their work. So I think that's a really, really important point. Do we have any other questions here? Oh wait, I've got, and somebody says, is this field of work not particularly prominent in Opus Dei? Can you speak to the Opus Dei question?
I can't really know. I thought Opus Dei was about, well, I suppose, yes, in terms of what I know about the vision, it's all spheres of life, but I don't know in any detail whether it is. I mean, where do you find it now? You find it still in the remains of the Cardine movement. The movement of Christian workers is still functioning, but small. You find it in some of the traditional lay associations, but we've had such a decline in Catholic associational life and a growth in the new spiritual movements. And I don't know whether in any of those movements that focus exists in the way that it did in the past. So I'm thinking of things like possibly Focolare, L'Arche, the tradition, the movements that were kind of big in the 80s and 90s and are still around. We've moved into a different ecclesiological framework and it's more complicated now, but I still think the question needs to be asked.
Yeah, I noticed that somebody put communion liberation in the chat box. Actually, I'm in that movement, and we do have an emphasis on work. I have to say that it's striking to me because it's very different from what I think what we live typically in the church today. So I actually had a question for Dr. Tastard about Florence Nightingale, because I felt like from your presentation that there was a kind of a critical moment where she actually was less engaged with her work or with the practical reality of her work. I felt that you were suggesting that she had lost a sense of like you said, human fragility as a factor in her experience. And I wondered if you've traced kind of that that movement in her, like what you would say about that is am I getting that right?
Very briefly, she campaigned right through the 1850s and early 60s for healthcare reform in the army and India, and in what were called laying-in institutions for women who were giving birth and needed a break from their tightly packed home in the slums. So she was intensely involved right up to about the mid 1860s, and then she did take a more spiritual turn. You're quite right, and that was the time of increased correspondence with Mother Mary Clare Moore. However, she was always a very fierce judge of her own failures and of the failures of others. And that, I think, inhibited her sometimes. She lacked the skills of negotiation, which sometimes would have been helpful. But nonetheless, as a bulldozer, she achieved incredible results.
Lisa, can I engage with Evan?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay. Evan, I wonder, one of the things, the links that I saw between what you were explaining in relation to the Flannery O'Connor story and the characters in that, and something that's in the YCW spirituality that struck me, is about how these women or these characters, how they have to fashion their own image of Christ, and how they have to kind of try and work out, you know, what the church presents is not somehow doesn't reach into their ordinary daily life, and so they find themselves they need to find an image of Christ. They need to find a way in. I mean, so for the young girls in YCW, it was Christ our worker King. So it was identifying with Christ as a worker. But certainly in the European YCWs, sometimes that went off into spirituality that we now regard as rather strange at times. Even getting into kind of sexual imagery between, because of their attachment to this figure of Christ, whom they presented as a romantic type. And partly this seems to me that perhaps the church, what they heard in their whatever they got by way of religious education, simply didn't give them anything, any way into knowing the person of Christ that reached them at all. And partly also that this tendency that we all have to try and create a Christ that we feel speaks to our own situation, and that we do it with the cultural material we have around us. I wonder if that makes sense to you as a kind of thematic that crosses our two concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. One question I was actually going to ask you is, in some sense, it seems like we are both writing about marginal figures in some sense, where the attempt to imitate Christ is in conflict with the prevailing, church teaching at the time. So the YMC, in trying to pursue Christ, they're going against kind of the patriarchal gender norms of the church at the time, and yeah, so one question that I'm kind of trying to work through is, when you just depart from some sort of church teaching at the time that you believe to be wrong, in service of Christ, it's so easy to just kind of go off in your own direction. And so how do you distinguish what is an authentic pursuit of Christ and an expression of who he is, and what is just kind of you doing your own thing? So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, that's the question that I was going to ask you, because I'm thinking about the same sorts of things.
Well, and I think for the YCW movement, this is why Cardine and those who followed him were very keen to have. I mean, every time there was a new pope, he would go off to Rome and explain it all in person to the Pope, so that it was clear, so that he had the kind of stamp of approval that it was orthodox. But once you unleash a movement like this, people find so many local accommodations, and they are creative from the basis of their own faith and experience. So I think it's always a negotiation, and I think think that's great, because it makes these marginal figures into authors of their own Christology, and perhaps it does cross over lines at times, but it's better than being stultified in a very limited idea that doesn't enable any encounter.
Right. Yeah.
Could I add something here which follows on immediately from what you both said? After she returned from the Crimean War, Nightingale wrote what's now called Suggestions for Thought. And in it, she played briefly with the idea of a female Christ. That is to say, after she thought of the Parousia, that Christ might return in female form. She didn't go far with it, but it's interesting that after that war experience, which shattered many people's preconceptions, she thought quite radically.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's quite interesting. Going back to what Massimo was talking about, paradox and the importance of paradox. And again, in all of these three papers, it feels as if there's a really lived experience of paradox at the heart of how all these figures tried to grapple with what faith meant, and a willingness to really question. And yet also, I mean, certainly for the YCW girls, then also being pulled back into the restrictive orthodoxies, you know, that kind of movement all the time between the daring of going to new places and doing new things and saying new things, but also that being pulled back, which the institution is so good at in history.
I'm struck with the fact that Florence Nightingale found herself going toward the medieval mystics, female mystics, because I think that in a way speaks to your question, Evan, about you know how does one, you know, not just go, you know, because paradox could lead you, you know, quite like right out there to a place where you don't want to end up, and how to remain in this relationship with the church, and yet live this paradox. And I think that those figures are very interesting figures, because if you really get in there with Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, their lives were just replete with situations like what we're talking about. I mean, Teresa of Avila was, terrible things were said about her by many men, and yet she had to live with a great, lived with a great depth of fervor and conviction, and lived that paradox. You know, that graced existence that was that looked messy to others, that looked unconventional, and was unconventional, because that's how it expresses. So I'm struck with that. I think that's a path for women, and I think these young worker women, you know, what they're not handed is they're not handed the whole tradition, you know, to be given very limited ways of accessing, you know, the image of Christ, you know. So they found themselves at the Song of Songs, it sounds like to me, you know. So why not give that to them through the great mystical tradition, which is already there?
Well, that's interesting, actually. Yes, I mean, if I can give you a quote, this is from the young women in YCW using the metaphor of a tree with Christ as the trunk, and they are the branches. And grace becomes their physical, spiritual, and even sexual nourishment. The quote is, "As the trunk sends all the sap into its branches, he spills his fertile grace into me. He wants it, he strives for it, he pushes me. And if he wants it so much, what should I long for in turn? Only one thing, his sap, his liquid flesh." And it goes on like that. And it's very interesting, because that also echoes some of the doubts that would have been had about Teresa of Avila's ecstatic imagery. And you know, it wouldn't be difficult to think that the church is frightened stiff of women using sexual imagery to talk about their relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
Could I add one little footnote about Florence? She spent a long time never attending any church, and then for the last 20 years of her life, she allowed a professor from Oxford to come and celebrate Holy Communion for herself alone 3 or 4 times a year. And I find that such a sad image. she had this radical questing mind. She'd done incredible social service, achieved incredible results which transformed the lives of women, and yet she couldn't find community.
Do you think that was psychological, temperamental, or was it that she didn't find anything adequate?
I think she only could believe what she could rationally convince herself to believe, and there's a tremendous integrity in that, but it does cut you off from community and the shared insights of community. So she never quite accessed that communal spirit of Teresa of Avila and others, which kept them, despite the depredations of men, kept them in the community, which continued to nourish them.
And in a sense, that's, you know, going back to what Massimo was saying about the big tent of Catholicism and so on, that's a bit that if you are going to be Catholic, you have to want that. You have to want the messy community in all its misshapen forms, don't you?
Yeah. Could I ask a quick question of Evan? What does Flannery O'Connor say about the racial issues of the Deep South? It's a big question, I know, but I'd love to hear something briefly.
Yeah, so she really wrestled with it for a long time, and she didn't write about it very much. I think there's been a big controversy recently about how racist Flannery O'Connor was, or you know, whether or not she was racist. But I think for the clearest look at her attempt to grapple with racial issues is her story, what's it called? Everything That Rises Must Converge. And it's an examination of a character who is purporting to be, you know, an advocate for racial equality, but he ends up actually using these African-American characters to try to prove how much of, you know, how moral he is. And so O'Connor, I think, is concerned about discussions about racial politics actually using the very people that it's purporting to help, which so she was, you know, I think over the course of her life grappling with her own kind of implicit, you know, received racism just from her own upbringing, but later on, as she's maturing as a writer, you can see her really trying to grapple with that and to almost address it at like a deeper metaphysical level than even kind of surface level political activism, if that makes any sense.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I wonder, just a question for all three of you, because the session particularly focuses on women, and we kind of touched on it there with the discussion of you know, women and, you know, this sexual imagery. I wonder what it is about women. Are we in a privileged place? I'm going to say we to grapple with the paradoxes. I mean, it seems like there's been a disadvantage in being a woman, but it seems to me what we're looking at here is the fact that women maybe have, I mean, do we have a better take on this reality?
So I'm almost nervous to answer this question because it feels, I don't want to get too essentialist, but okay, this is just speaking from personal experience, and so, you know, this could be nature, nurture, whatever, but in talking, for example, with male Dominicans versus female Dominicans, I often find that men theologians tend to bifurcate the intellectual and the physical in a way that a lot of women religious don't seem to do. And so, you know, Edith Stein had the theory that women's souls were much more united to their bodies. And so I think you could make some sort of argument that women are just more incarnational by nature. But again, I don't know. That's just complete conjecture on my part, and I'm very nervous about saying anything like that because it seems too essentialist.
Yeah. No,
But that's just a thought.
well, it's good to get it out there. It provokes conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I'd share the concern about essentializing, but the reality is that we live in a culture that has essentialized, and we're formed and shaped in it. So it's you kind of can't deny that. I think it's not so much privileged as particular, specific, and containing a whole lot of bits of truth that don't otherwise get out. So I think that the importance of women's voices and perspectives, if they need privileging, it's because they've been ignored rather than or so often not heard or left outside, and they are still nowhere near on equal terms in the church, not at all, or in many other spheres in which we're talking. I filled in a survey last week about inclusion in theology and religious studies departments. We've made lots of progress, but we're nowhere near there, and some of the issues of huge concern to women, I've worked a lot on violence against women and prostitution, are still nowhere near high enough on the agenda that's set in a different way than it would be set if there really was equality. So I don't think it's privileged, but I think it's particular and urgent.
On the issue of essentialism, I can't escape having thought 20 years ago that Carol Gilligan might have been right in saying that men start from autonomy and work towards a kind of communion, whereas women start with a sense of openness to others and work towards autonomy. But to me, the issues in the church revolve around power, and we haven't really been able to listen to the voices of women when they challenge us on power. And I apologize. At the beginning, I should have said I'm a Catholic priest. Interestingly, I don't do that because I feel people wouldn't hear me otherwise. But I should have said so because it is relevant to this discussion. But yes, power, how we use it, accountability above all, is what women bring to the church at the moment.
Well, this was a fabulous session. I want to thank all three of our presenters for really top-notch presentations and discussion. We are going to be taking a little break now. We'll be back in main session at 1700 GMT. And that's going to be Lived Catholicism and Post-Secular Society with Dr. Michelle Dillon from the University of New Hampshire. Thank you, everyone.